So I'd just like to introduce Kevin Wood. He's currently the Deputy Chair of the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre, but some of you, I'm sure, know Kevin in various roles in water and wetland and natural resource management across Victoria. So over to you, Kevin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lance. Do you stick the toothbrush on the outside or the inside? Last talk for the day, eh? Lucky me. I'm standing up at least. So one of the advantages of being my age is that you get to share an anecdote and you don't get howls of derision, hopefully, from the audience. So I'll start my talk in that way and hopefully stick within the time. So when I was a young fellow, my family moved from the urban wasteland of Footscray in a suburb of Melbourne out to the fringe, as it was then, of a new estate in Avondale Heights. And it was a classic, right? There was paddocks, new houses going up, holes dug, foundations and the like. No sewerage, no drainage, no made roads. That's how they did it in those days. And living up there in Melbourne particularly, you'd get those summer hot nights and must have been 40 degrees, but it was Fahrenheit in those days, so I don't know what it was, but it was bloody hot. And on some of those nights, Dad, he'd come home from work and he'd put his bottle of Melbourne Bitter aside. You call them long necks these days, but they were bottles in those days. And he'd say, let's go to the beach. And we'd say, yeah, that'd be great. Let's go to the beach. So we'd all pile in the car, a light green FC panel van, as it was, and we'd haul off down to the coast, down to Altona. And it was the back beaches then. We'd drive across the salt marsh and we'd hit the mud flats and we'd scoot and keep cool down. And it was fantastic. I used to have this skiffle board. You know what a skiffle board is? It's a round, flat piece of wood with sloping edges on it. And what you'd do is you'd fling it across the sand or the mud flats and you'd go running after it and you'd jump on it and ride it like a surfboard. And it was fantastic. And when I used to do it down in Altona, there'd be these big mobs of little brown birds that would all skittle out of the way and run away and fly and jump out. And I thought, oh, look at that, wasn't that fun? So it was many years later that I realised what they were and how important that area was for those birds. And I, not surprisingly, spent most of my working life looking after them and their habitats. So I'm just doing a bit of penance, I think. Actually, and one of the disadvantages of getting old is that sometimes you forget things and also that you can't see so well. So when you see me put my glasses on, I need to refer to my notes to remember what I have to say. So, as you might have gathered, on the doorstep of Victoria's capital, Melbourne, lies a wetland wonderland where thousands of birds and humans compete and jostle for their daily bread. Or in the case of the shorebirds, polychaete worms, and in the case of humans, meaningful recreational experiences. And the birds have been particularly resilient and tolerant, but I don't think that's going to go on forever because they're certainly showing the impacts of our effects on those birds. So today I'm going to talk to you about this magnificent area, a wetland wonderland, the Cheetham and Altona Key Biodiversity Area. And I'm also going to talk about level of protection under Ramsar, and I'm going to follow up with what doesn't Ramsar cover and how can we actually protect some of those areas that aren't included in Ramsar. So, I'm also endeavouring not to talk to my slides all the time because I think it's much better to talk to you. But that means that I forget which slide I'm going to show first. So this is the Cheetham and Altona Key Biodiversity Area right on the footsteps of Melbourne. It's a length of coast of about 20 kilometres, not far from Melbourne, as you can see. It stretches from Point Cook in the south and west all the way up, and it's not shown on the map, all the way up to Point Gellibrand at Williamstown. So that's Point Cook down the south. I won't use the pointer yet because that's very difficult. And it's a beautiful complex wonderland of wetlands. Another shot looking west. And it consists of quite a variety of different wetland types. We've got 3 estuaries, 4 if you count the mouth of the Yarra, and it extends that far. And old salt pans from a salt harvesting facility, freshwater wetlands and lakes, a large salt lake, a lot of salt marsh vegetation and coastal vegetation. So it's quite a myriad complex. Now, you'll see from both of those slides that it's surrounded by development. It's surrounded by urban development and industrial development. If you go back to that previous slide, over in the top corner, that was the Altona Industrial Complex. Petrochemical industries, a refinery, mobile refinery. But surprisingly, it was undeveloped for much of of European history in this area because it had swamps everywhere and they couldn't build on them. And it was not a very suitable place. It also had the hard surface was actually basalt, and it was very hard to build on because your plaster would crack in your houses. So it wasn't a very nice place to build for people. And it was only in the second half of the 20th century that was actually developed in any substantial way. And it was only, so a lot of the houses that you see down in the western side of the development were really only built there in the last 20, 30 years. But Melbourne's gone crazy now, so there's quite a lot of development. Just a look at the other end. This is an area of mudflats at the mouth of Cororoit Creek. And I'm showing you this because this is quite important for later on. The mudflats along this section of coast are really the engine room of the wetlands in terms of where the birds feed. So there's a very important site at the mouth of Cororoit Creek. That's the mobile refinery over there. This wetland complex here is a freshwater wetland complex. It goes from here right up to the other end that you can see. That was constructed. It was constructed in order to protect this coastal area from the development of an old rifle range, the Williamstown Rifle Range. And that's another interesting story in itself. But that was built to treat stormwater coming off the development, but also to stop people getting down onto the coast to protect the birds. It's one of the few areas of freshwater left in the area, and we can see lots of things coming back there now, diving ducks, for instance, bluebell ducks and musk ducks and the like. And it's good that it came back because just to the north was the site of the Maddocks Road Swamp, a deep freshwater marsh, which was drained some time ago. The other... This is Laverton Creek, as they call it now. It's a 30-metre wide drainage channel that drained Truganina Swamp, another beautiful deep freshwater marsh, to prevent flooding of the industrial estates that were being built. So now, next I'm going to talk about the levels of protection that have been provided to these areas. The first was, of course, Ramsar. So this is the Western Port Phillip Bay and Bellarine Peninsula Ramsar site. Quite a diverse range of wetlands included in it, but I won't talk about all the rest. This is the area up here at Point Cook and Cheetham. And it only covers a very small proportion of the wetlands that I showed you just before. And the reason was that they only included public land. So a lot of the Cheetham Salt Works, for instance, was actually under lease to Cheetham Salt, so they couldn't include that. That was, and the site was largely designated because of the bird life. Very, very high numbers of water birds, particularly ducks, lots of ducks, and migratory shorebirds. Port Phillip Bay is one of the most important sites in Victoria and Australia for migratory shorebirds. Something like 45 to 65,000 shorebirds migrate to there every summer. Come to Altona for their summer holidays, actually. So that was the first designation. That was 1982. This was number 18 on the Ramsar, on Australia's Ramsar sites list. Soon after that, and the investigation had started when the Ramsar nomination process was going on, there was an investigation undertaken in what was then the Port Phillip Authority and later in the Ministry for Planning and Environment that identified where are all these important bird habitats around Port Phillip Bay. And we used Brett Lane. I don't know if you've heard of that name. Brett was a great choice because at the time he was the national coordinator of the Shorebirds program in BirdLife Australia. And he was in the process of mapping and analysing all the data from around Australia about where the shorebird sites were. So he was a great choice. And he identified, using basically the criteria from the Ramsar Convention, the 1% population, that there were actually 5 sites of international significance around Port Phillip Bay. The Altona region up here, and Werribee Avalon, the Moolap Salt Works down there, Swan Bay and Mud Islands. So you can see there's quite a few there that weren't included in the Ramsar site. Oops. So they were designated international significance particularly because of those 6 shorebird species. It's since been revised a bit because the national numbers of the red-necked avocet, which is an Australian shorebird, have gone up since we've collected more data. So why is Altona a site of international significance? That report identified that there were quite a few species. The red-necked stint, a migratory shorebird, the smallest one, packs up its carry-on luggage, reduces its body weight by 1/3 in order to take on all the fat so it can make the migration, filling its body up with fat. It doesn't fly all the way like the bar-tailed godwit. It stops off along the way. But it's largely a coastal bird. That's probably the ones I used to skittle with my skiffle board. Curlew sandpiper, similarly a coastal species, although they do feed inland as well. Whoops. And 2 there, sharp-tailed sandpiper down below. He's a bit more gregarious. It'll eat in freshwater wetlands all the way across Australia. In fact, this year we didn't get virtually any sharp-tailed sandpipers down at Altona because there was so much water inland that it was enjoying. Green shank were in numbers of international significance. The quirky kiwi, the double-banded plover, this one flies across to Australia from New Zealand in the winter. And Altona and Cheetham have the highest numbers of this species in Port Phillip Bay and Victoria. And the red-necked avocet, as I said, which is now gone, no longer of international significance in the Altona region because we found a lot more. So in 2009, BirdLife Australia, in accordance with protocols developed by BirdLife International, designated important bird areas right across the country. And in the Altona area, they designated an important bird area as outlined there. And you can see a few more of the wetlands than what the Ramsar Treaty identified. The Point Cook Park, the Cheetham Wetlands, Truganina Swamp, Colroy Creek, Altona North area, some rocks offshore Seaholme where the waders in transit across the bay to feed at North Altona sit and wait till conditions are right before they feed there. And as well as migratory shorebirds, analysing the data which had only been collected by volunteers over the years revealed that the numbers of chestnut teal were actually of international significance, because that's actually quite small populations in Australia, 100,000 birds only. And Pacific gulls, there's only about 5,000 of these in the world. They breed on offshore islands and come up in winter actually after breeding to sit around on the Altona coast. And then more recently, BirdLife Australia was commissioned by the federal government to have a look at the latest data and identify all the national and international shorebird sites in Australia. And they designated and recognised again the Cheetham-Altona area, which they called the Point Cook to Williamstown International Shorebird Site. And they, in analysing the data again, they identified that there were 4 species that still met the criteria for international significance. What's also interesting is, though, that they identified all these mudflats down here at Point Cook, all the way along the coast of Cheetham, up here at North Altona, and the rocky promontories here at Seaholme, but they also said Point Gellibrand here and Sandy Point, Greenwich Bay was an important part of the site, and that's because in recent times some local birdos had noticed hundreds of shorebirds here. Now it's quite possible that they're over here feeding on a very small area of mudflat because they're getting disturbed over here. There happens to be the dog beach next to the important shorebird site. So just a word about how these birds move, because this is really quite important to understand why habitats need to be considered in their planning in regard to Ramsar sites, without trying to make it too complicated. Brett Lane did this work when he did a report on the natural values of the Cheetham salt fields when they were being passed over into the public estate. So the salt works, which is a large complex of salt pans, that's a bit like the dormitory and the morning tea room for the shorebirds. It's safe from disturbance, no one can get in there, and they can sit around there and roost if they want to without being disturbed. They can also feed in the salt pans. But the real food is to be found in the dining room up here at North Altona, you see. And so they'll be seen as the tide falls, flying across the bay to go to North Altona and feed there, because they're very rich mudflats. Work they did for the Williamstown Rifle Range EES found that there's as much benthic biomass offshore from the mouth of Corroy Creek as there is offshore from the Western Treatment Plant, which probably says something nasty about Corroy Creek, but no. Anyway, so the birds also fly and feed on the mudflats adjacent to the Cheetham Saltworks themselves, and they also fly down to the Point Cook Park and feed on the mudflats there and into the RAF base down at Point Cook. Now, Port Phillip Bay has got some particular characteristics. Now, first of all, being dependent on mudflats for your food is precarious. Tide heights, they vary throughout the month and throughout the year. Sometimes there's hardly any mudflats exposed even at low tide. So there's that variability, which means they maximise the time they can have in feeding there, and that's why you see them going hell for leather there, sowing in the mud, trying to get as much as they can. But in Port Phillip Bay, it's even worse than that. Sometimes you get these big cold fronts that pass over southern Victoria, and there's a low pressure, and what the low pressure means is that water levels rise for a start under low pressure, but then secondly you get these huge southerly winds which drive the waves across the bay and inundate all the mudflats on here. And so what the birds need... Oh, look, I've got to use this. I can't help myself. I should have been using it all along. Sorry about that. Probably won't work now. Here we go. So at those times, birds need supplementary feeding areas so they can actually go inland and keep feeding. And they used to go into the shallow margins of what was Cherry Swamp, now Cherry Lake, and they also used to go into Truganina Swamp to feed, and they also used to go into Spectacle Lakes down here at Point Cook Park. They also had alternative roosts down here at on the shores of this big salt lake called Raft Lake. So those areas are very important for the shorebirds, and you'll see them feeding most, and they have their greatest physiological need when they've just arrived from overseas on their long migration or before they're about to take off to fly away again. And so if you get a wind-driven high tide out of sequence, then these birds have really got to have somewhere else to go to get a feed. So these other habitats are just as important as those mudflats and those salt pans. So, which brings me to my next topic, just briefly. So there has been a review of Ramsar sites undertaken by the department, and it arose out of the Ramsar management plan for the Port Phillip Bay Ramsar plan, and so they're looking to expand the boundaries of the Ramsar site. So the yellow areas are the existing boundaries, and the blue areas are the ones proposed to be included in the Ramsar site. So you can see, you know, there's not would appear to be not a lot of adjustment, but there's some very important areas up there in North Altona. They're proposing to include all of the Cheetham Salt Works and the the mud flats up in North Altona. So that's great. If you have a look at them in a bit more detail, you can see that you know, there's some quite large areas that are going to be included in there. So that's a real positive. And I don't need to talk about the criteria for including it because Andrea has already done that for me. Probably one of the most important criteria which affected what would be included and what wouldn't be included is, would the current management agencies accept it being included in the Ramsar site? In technical terms, did they believe that they would be able to manage it to maintain the Ramsar values into the future, is the way to put it. And that's one of the criteria, and that's fair enough. I have complete sympathy. I mean, who would want a Ramsar designation over your facility? I'm serious. So why would Melbourne Water want another Ramsar designation over an area it manages? It got one over the farm, and look at the work it had to do for the EPBC Act there. So these are the areas that weren't included and are unlikely to be. There's been some dialogue with the department, and that's great, about including some of these sites, but we expect that they won't all make it. The whole of Point Cook, Skeleton Creek, Truganina Swamp and Laverton Creek, the rocks offshore from, the rocks offshore from Seahome, Cherry Lake, Lower Corroy Creek, the lakes at the Williamstown Lakes, Point Gellibrand and Greenwich Bay. So we had to come up with some way of determining, well, okay, if they're not included in the Ramsar site, what can you do? So we've got a 6-point plan. And essentially, you've seen it all, Andrew, don't worry. It's assuming the Ramsar site's going to be, with its new boundaries, is going to be managed by a Ramsar plan. So and it's going to have a coordinating committee of all the land managers in it, and they're going to all have actions to do. So the first thing that I believe should happen is that all of those other habitats that aren't in the Ramsar boundaries should be designated as important associated habitats, or some other nice term which means that they're just as important to the Ramsar values as the ones that are in the boundaries. Secondly, that those sites should be included in the Ramsar management plan. They should actually be dealt with in the management plan. The third thing is that funding should be applied to them in the same way in the planning process as it is for the other areas in the Ramsar site. And importantly after that, is that 4 or 5? Can't remember. 3? No, it's 4. Come on, see? Glasses are out. It was 4. Oh, I thought so, yeah. And this is something that's only particular to the Port Phillip Bay Ramsar site, that because it's such a big site covering such diverse habitats, we believe that each of those sites of international significance should be monitored and reported on separately in the management plan. Not be all lumped up together and reported as one Ramsar site, because I know I've analysed the data for the Cheetham Saltworks, and they're all going down for the shorebirds from 1987 to 2021. Sorry, they're not all going down, but 9 of the 12 are going down. But when you look at the data for the Western Treatment Plant, they're not all going down. So something's going on at Cheetham that's not going on at other sites. So that's the fifth and really important point. So someone's got to look at the data. I think I'm the only person in the world that looked at that data ever. To analyse trends, I mean. I know you looked at it. For that site. And the last point, levels of acceptable change. Now, we need some for each internationally significant site, not just for the Ramsar site as a whole, because there are different things going on at each of those sites. So we need to know, when do we need to do something about Cheetham and Altona that we may not even have to worry about for Werribee, because there's things going on. So the premise behind all of this is that the shorebirds don't move much between sites in this case. The double-banded plovers never leave Cheetham wetlands.
Sorry.
So we can actually deal with them as individual separate sites, at least for shorebirds. So that's the 6-point plan that I think should be considered for how do you manage Ramsar values in non-Ramsar sites. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. We've got time for a question. So.
Thanks for that, Kevin. One answer to that, which I don't think governments like, or governments don't do very well at all, is that the Ramsar Convention obligations apply to all wetlands, as we heard in some of the previous talks. And the way that's through the wise use provision, not through the Ramsar listing. But since 2005, that's been defined, and Australia agreed to this, is that you have to maintain the ecological character. Wise use is maintenance of the ecological character. There's a few other words after that. So in theory, legally in fact, we should be looking after those sites. Are we not? And there was also another, in the previous strategic plan for the convention, there was a clause which Europeans had put in, was that once a site was assessed to meet the Ramsar criteria, it should be treated as if it was a Ramsar site. And that was in there for 10 years. It's now been taken out of the current plan, and I don't see it going back into the next one they're doing. But it was actually used on one occasion, I know, in Australia in a court case in Tasmania, I can't remember the place, where someone used that one to stop a coastal development as part of the court case. They used that clause. So it had been assessed as meeting the criteria, and the magistrate or whoever it was took it into account, but it's not there anymore. So, and it's not there anymore because the governments have taken it out.
Yeah, look, does that work? I haven't got all the answers, but I'm just very familiar with this particular site, and some of the things that apply here may not apply elsewhere. However, including, in fact, who said 3 only? Yes, you're right, I missed a point in the 6-point plan. That point is, I'll get to that, that if these sites that are not classed as Ramsar related sites and included in the management plan, then what happens on those sites is entirely determined by the management priorities of the agency that's responsible for them. And they're very responsible agencies, I don't have any argument with that. But there's at least 2 major sites in that complex in Altona that are not being managed primarily for their Ramsar values. That is, protecting the habitats of significant shorebirds. And if there's no other requirement on them to manage those sites primarily for their Ramsar values, then those habitats are going to decline in their usefulness for shorebirds. And those 2 sites, it's not on that slide, are the supplementary feeding areas that the birds go to when they can't get onto the mudflats on Port Phillip Bay. So unless you have those management plans for those sites, have a provision that they have to manage primarily or give a priority to managing Ramsar values in those sites, like the such and such habitat management plan, then that won't take precedence necessarily. And that's not what happens.
Thanks, Kevin. Very interesting. So I'm just curious to know, so there's a handful of matters of national environmental significance protected by the EPBC Act, which includes all of the listed migratory species, all the listed endangered species, and includes probably all the species you're talking about. So I'm wondering why, of the MNES, you're picking them, why you're calling them Ramsar values when you could say that they were one of the other MNES, which we have a legal obligation to be managing as well.
So how are the management prescriptions being applied using those other requirements?
Well, just like any of the other things are listed under the EPBC Act.
Yeah, so what it means if somebody looks to move and do something in that habitat which might affect that habitat, then they might have to apply for a permit from the federal government.
They've got to,
which won't happen.
Put themselves forward they've got to do self-assessment. They've got to put themselves forward.
The only reason I'm focusing on the Ramsar site and Ramsar values is that there's a Ramsar plan, and within that there is a rational scope for undertaking actions to protect those Ramsar values.
What about the Port Phillip Bay Environmental Management Plan?
Yeah, but that's so broad that it doesn't deal with Truganina Swamp.
I mean, the problem that we have, of course, is there's always limited funds. There is absolutely a limit to the amount of money we can spend. We got audited in 2016 by the Victorian Auditor General's Office. We got raked over the coals about having things in the management plan that were not critical components, processes and services, were not related to the things that the site were listed for. We don't do that anymore. So I could see that there would be an issue with that. Now, that's not to say that these areas shouldn't be managed and that the threats to these areas shouldn't be managed. They should be. But there are limits to what we can do.
This is not going to cost a cracker more. How's that? Because those other sites have very competent, conscientious management authorities looking after them.
Well, so then why would we...
The only trouble is that the management plans for those sites do not prioritise Ramsar values in those plans. That's all I'm calling for, is to say managing, because you've got to manage the whole shoreboard complex up there. You can't just say, well, they're looking after that site, they're looking after that site, everything's going to be hunky-dory, because it won't.
So I can say to the room that these sites are being assessed. They're currently being assessed just as all the other sites are.
Yeah.
So there's not been any decision made. They're all being assessed on their value.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks very much, Kevin. We can have a standing ovation while Kevin starts.
Thank you.